When most people think of Lucille Ball, they understandably think of I Love Lucy, the show which starred Lucy and her husband Desi Arnaz as Ricky and Lucy Ricardo, ran for 180 episodes over 6 seasons at CBS. While she's most famous for her work in television, Lucy also enjoyed a long film career, appearing in movies from the 1930s through the 1970s. And since today would have been Lucy's 107th birthday, I'm dedicating this episode of A Million Movies to Lucille Ball. Here's a tease of what's to come. The first movie I ever remember seeing Lucy in was in 1954's The Long, Long Trailer. Now, someone who only knew Lucy as Lucy Ricardo, this movie seemed very familiar to me. Instead of Lucy and Ricky, we get Tacy and Nikki, newlyweds who decide to live out of a trailer instead of going into debt buying a house. Now, on their very first trip, right after the wedding, Desi is still learning how to work the trailer's brakes, and he accidentally runs past a red light and stops in the middle of an intersection. Fortunately, Keenan Wynn is there as a local traffic cop to get everything under control until they can get the trailer moving again. Now, in the background of the scene, you'll see a movie theater showing the Band Wagon. It's fitting that the Band Wagon is on the marquee, as it was the film director Vincent Minnelli filmed just prior to starting his next project, directing this movie, The Long, Long Trailer. One of my favorite scenes in the Band Wagon is the Dancing in the Dark number featuring Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse. Their characters are unsure they can perform together in a new musical they're developing, and as they're out for a carriage ride in New York, they stop and perform this number. And as they're doing that, they realize not only can they perform together, but they also begin to fall in love. Now, both the theme of this number, of two people discovering that they do have things in common and that they may actually be falling in love with each other, and even the setting were reflected in La La Land in 2016. Like with Fred and Sid, a lyrical dance in a park set to A Lovely Night helps Ryan and Emma begin to realize that they might be good together as well. Now, La La Land is a classic movie lover's dream movie. It has dozens of references to films that we love. The Broadway Melody of 1940, Funny Face, Singin' in the Rain, and Sweet Charity are just some of the films that inspired parts of La La Land. Even non-musical films like Casablanca, Bringing Up Baby, and Notorious get mentions. But one of the most direct references is to Rebel Without a Cause. Going beyond the scenes and even almost identical shots that were filmed at Griffith Observatory, the film itself is included in La La Land when Ryan Gosling's character invites Emma Stone's character to see a screening of Rebel at the Rialto Theater in South Pasadena. The Rialto is a classic movie house that opened in 1925. Now, in addition to showing movies for more than 80 years before it closed in 2007, it's also been in its share of movies. So in addition to La La Land, Scream 2, and even the music video for Michael Jackson's Thriller had scenes filmed at the Rialto. Now, one of my favorite movies shot there was The Player. In The Player, Tim Robbins' character is trying to track down someone who has been threatening him, and he thinks it's a screenwriter played by Vincent D'Onofrio. He finds out that D'Onofrio's character is at the Rialto watching a screening of The Bicycle Thief. Now, the role of the screenwriter in Hollywood is a recurring theme in The Player. That's why one of my favorite connections in this movie occurs during a scene where Robbins' character is watching dailies with his team, and he gets a message that Joe Gillis is on the phone.
Know who this is?
Joe Gillis, never heard of him.
He said you're not.
Anybody know who Joe Gillis is?
He's the character William Holden played in Sunset Boulevard, the writer who gets killed by the movie star.
Gloria Swanson.
Robbins' character doesn't immediately recognize the name Joe Gillis, but others in the room correctly identify the name as the William Holden character, a screenwriter, in Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard. Now, in The Player, the screenwriter is beaten and then drowned in a small pool of water. That's similar to the fate that met the Joe Gillis character when he was shot and left floating dead in the pool of forgotten film star Norma Desmond. That shot in Sunset Boulevard was actually shot on Wilshire Boulevard at the estate of the second Mrs. J. Paul Getty. The studio installed the pool with the understanding that if Mrs. Getty didn't like the pool, the studio would remove it and restore the landscaping she had originally. Apparently, she liked the pool because 4 years later, James Dean, Natalie Wood, and Sal Mineo had a scene where they climb into the very same pool while exploring an old abandoned mansion in Rebel Without a Cause. And of course, Rebel Without a Cause includes its own references to other movies, including this scene.
I love you too.
Hey, stop!
That is, of course, a reference to A Streetcar Named Desire, starring Marlon Brando as Stanley Kowalski.
Hey, Stella!
Director Elia Kazan had directed the original Broadway production of A Streetcar Named Desire, and he kept a lot of the feel of the stage play in his movie. In fact, other than a few on-location shots like the scene in the railway station, most of A Streetcar Named Desire was shot on sound stages on the Warner Brothers lot. Now, when the film was complete, the incredible sets depicting New Orleans were sent off to storage until 3 years later. That's when George Cukor brought them back out, had them painted white, and then used them as set pieces for the Lose That Long Face number in the 1954 version of A Star Is Born with Judy Garland. Now, the 1954 version of A Star Is Born is the second time the movie had been made. There was the original 1937 version starring Janet Gaynor and Frederick March, Judy's version in 1954 with James Mason, the 1976 version with Barbra Streisand and Chris Christopherson, and a fourth version due out later this year starring Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga. The original 1937 version of A Star Is Born was nominated for a number of Academy Awards, including one for the screenplay by Robert Carson, Alan Campbell, and Dorothy Parker. In addition to writing dozens of screenplays, Dorothy Parker was also a critic, well known for a sharp wit. In fact, one of her more quotable lines comes from a review that she wrote about a Broadway performance featuring Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn was appearing in a play called The Lake in 1934, and Parker thought Hepburn's performance was flat and wrote, "She runs the gamut of emotions all the way from A to B." Now, The Lake was one of the biggest flops in Hepburn's career. In fact, when the producer announced he was planning to extend the show's run by moving the production to Chicago, Hepburn paid the producer $14,000 out of her own pocket to get him to close the show so she could move on to other projects. Now, for all its faults, the play did have one line that stuck with Hepburn, and she included it 3 years later while shooting Stage Door.
The calla lilies are in bloom again. Such a strange flower.
The Calla Lilies line became a signature line for Hepburn and eventually found its way into other movies, including comedies like Big Top Pee-wee.
Look, Vance, the calla lilies are in bloom again.
And just to bring this back to where we started, it's even featured in an episode of I Love Lucy.
Tell me, Mrs. Ricardo, have you ever considered acting?
Has she ever considered acting?
Well, the calla lilies are in bloom again. Really, they are. I mean, oh, those calla lilies, mamma mia, they got
And finally, it's fitting that Lucy referenced that line from Stage Door because in the audience during that part of the movie is Lucille Ball herself. So let's review the connections we've covered today. We started with everyone's favorite redhead, Lucille Ball, who starred in the Long Long Trailer with Desi Arnaz, which featured a scene where you can see the Band Wagon on a movie theater marquee. The Band Wagon inspired a dance number in La La Land, which had a scene shot at the Rialto Theater in South Pasadena, which is the same theater featured in The Player that has a scene where a character gets a call from Joe Gillis, which is the name of the screenwriter in Sunset Boulevard, who's found floating in a pool that was later featured in Rebel Without a Cause, which included lines from A Streetcar Named Desire, which had its sets repurposed for a number in the 1954 version of A Star Is Born, which was a remake of a 1937 film by the same name. That was written by Dorothy Parker, who gave a scathing but hilarious review of a Katharine Hepburn play, a line from which became a featured moment in Stage Door, which co-starred Lucille Ball. And we've come full circle. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you have a favorite movie star, a specific film, or even a type of movie you think would make a good episode, please be sure to let me know in the comments below. And until then, thank you again for watching A Million Movies.